time. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the COVID Café number 5. Today we focus on the effects of the global COVID crisis for refugees and migrants. And I think we have, again, a very nice panel of speakers this afternoon. And I really must thank Oxfam Novib for arranging this relevant panel and the speakers we have today. The COVID Café is a co-production of Oxfam Novib and KUNO. And my name is Heintze. I am the coordinator of KUNO, Platform for Humanitarian Knowledge Exchange in the Netherlands. Welcome, everybody. I hope all attendees, we are running up to 20, and I'm sure more people will come because almost 40 or 50 people did register. Please do also join the conversations by using the chat box. You're already doing it. Maybe you can share your name, the organization you work for, but also comment on what we are talking about. And you can also post your questions by using the Q&A box. Both the chat box and the Q&A box are accessible via the toolbar down below in your screen. I think that are the basic the technicalities. The COVID Café is a way to inform people and to open up the discussion on relevant issues related to COVID. And I think I'm going to introduce the speakers of today. From Uganda, I'm very pleased we have Mary Monday. Mary Monday works for ICAN, and ICAN is a refugee-led community-based organization operating in Bidi refugee settlement. And Bidi is one of the biggest refugee camps in the world, I think, based in northern Uganda. We have Byrne from Amnesty International. Ian is head of refugee and migrants rights of Amnesty International, and he will explain more about the principles of protection for migrants and displacement. And from Oxfam International, we have Evelien van Roemburg. She is the European Migration Campaign Manager, and she knows really what is going on for the refugees and migrants in Greece and Italy. I'm very pleased we have you with us this afternoon. Evelien van Roemburg is also the co-host. That means basically, at least, you can pop at any time you like, Evelien. I have 2 extra questions for you. At the end, what did you learn today? But at the beginning, what do you hope to learn? I saw that Oxfam Novib immediately said, migrants, we should do something with refugees and migrants related to this COVID crisis. Why is it so important? And what would you hope to learn today?
Thanks, and thanks also for KUNO for organizing this and for you know, organizing a webinar on this really important topic. What we've heard so much about is that the COVID pandemic has been a leveler, right? Because the virus is not making a difference between you and me, right? Everyone can be hit, but what we've actually seen is that it's exacerbating already existing vulnerabilities and increasing inequalities. So what I hope to see and learn also from the other speakers, which I'm super happy that they're here today, is how in their context the crisis and the pandemic has caused these kind of inequalities and how it has impacted on migrants and refugees in particular. But also I really hope to hear some positive stories about how migrants and refugees have actually contributed to the fight against the pandemic and how how this contribution has also been valued in the communities that they live in and that they, that they work in. Yeah, so I hope to get some inspiring input as well.
Thank you, Evelien. There's one more person I would like to introduce. That is my colleague, Johanna Kalis. She will help me out with checking the chat box and the questions and answers. So if necessary, I hop over to Johanna and ask her to give us an update what is going on in the chat box. Thank you, Johanna. Good to have you aboard as well. I think what would be a logical order is to start with Mary Monday, closest to the refugees, then perhaps ask Evelien to share her comments on what is going on in Greece and Italy. And I think Ian has most helicopter view, and also he can explain more about those 14 principles of protection for migrants and displacement. So Mary Monday from ICAN, a refugee-led community-based organization in Bidi refugee settlement in northern Uganda. Mary, are you with us? The floor is yours. I see you're still muted, so I will unmute you, Mary. I think we should, oh.
I feel like her screen is frozen.
Yeah. Okay. I think then best is to move on, and maybe either Wouter, he is in the attendees, can try to connect to Mary Monday in a different way. And then we start with your contribution, Evelien. Is that good? Is that
Sure,
okay?
yeah. Yeah, no
Okay,
problem.
please.
Yes.
And I hope Mary Monday will join us later.
Thanks. Yeah. So as Oxfam International, we work all across the globe on different issues, of course, including on displacement and migration. But my position and my focus has been mostly on Europe. So this is where my contribution will focus on. As we all know, the COVID crisis has had a huge impact on mobility of everyone, including refugees and migrants. And we've seen that in Europe, where the arrivals have decreased with 25% in the first 4 months of this year. So that means that people are stuck. They're stuck, for example, in Libya, which we all know the situation is really terrible. But even if they manage to get on a boat in Northern Africa, they're often also stuck at sea because a lot of the ports in Europe have closed their borders. And we've seen that in Italy and we've seen that in Malta. So people have been forced to stay on these boats for weeks and weeks with really terrible situation for all of them. We've also seen that migrant workers haven't been able to move, either to move towards work or back home to their families if they wished to do so. And we've also seen really difficult living situations, both in refugee camps across Europe. Of course, the most infamous are the ones in Greece, on the Greek islands, the EU-sponsored hotspots there, but also in Serbia, for example, where we work, where the government facilities have been closed down and really over capacity. So there were major health risks for refugees in these camps, but there has also been health risks for migrants who are sometimes irregular and didn't have the capacity or the ability to access the health services and proper accommodation. And finally, we've seen a huge rise in xenophobia, which was already on the rise in Europe, as we all know, in the past few years or maybe even decade. But during this crisis, it has become worse. So focusing on migrants in the first place, the migration and asylum policies in Europe have been really terrible already for a long time and have been shamefully inadequate in addressing the needs of people on the move. And the COVID-19 crisis have made that only worse. So we've seen a lot of narratives in the media from particularly right-wing politicians saying that refugees and migrants are posing a health risk without acknowledging the fact that a lot of migrants are just in the same boat as we are, right? Because we're only safe if everyone is safe. And by saying that, we're also not acknowledging that a lot of migrants and irregular migrants in particular have been contributing so much to European societies and continue to do so during this crisis, particularly those working in agriculture or those working in domestic care, or domestic work or care jobs or in cleaning jobs. And they really had essential roles during this pandemic. So because many of them are irregular, they had to continue doing this job while at the same time didn't have any access to health, were forced to live in very small spaces or moving around. So the crisis have made them only more vulnerable or put them in a more vulnerable position. And then focusing on refugees, on the other hand, the situation in Southern Europe and also the lack of any responsibility sharing across European member states was already really problematic and has been problematic since 2015, when there was quite a big influx of refugees into Europe. And ever since, the European member states have been grappling to take care of people on the move and to take ownership. So all of that has resulted in Greece, where we work, in hotspots. So that's EU-sponsored camps on the Greek islands that are really woefully insufficient for people who are living there, who are forced to live there. So many of those camps are over capacity. Lesbos, the camp on Lesbos, for example, has 18,000 residents where there's only place for 3,000. There's lack of proper sanitation. There's almost no access to doctors. So the situation was already really, really terrible. And every time we think it can't get worse, and then in February and March, the pandemic came on top of all of that. So it became actually much worse. And of course, there's no way for these people to be able to access doctors or to socially distance themselves. And with only one tap for 300 people, it's very difficult to, you know, to keep your hygiene levels on a good standard. So that was already really bad. But what made it even worse is that the Greek government, the 1st of May, decided to not allow anyone to file for asylum anymore. So the right of asylum was basically abolished in Greece, which led to an enormous outcry from local organizations, from national partner organizations of Oxfam, like the Greek Council for Refugees, from us as well, but luckily also from EU institutions. So the Greek government, under all this pressure, reversed its position, and from the 1st of April made it available, made asylum available again. But all of this situation, so both the enormous number of people in the islands and continuous people arriving in the islands, although it's less than last year, really created a huge backlog. So now people have to wait sometimes for 2 years before they can get registered. So when we think about what the pandemic caused in Europe, is that quite a bad situation already, both for particular irregular migrants and for refugees. Refugees became much worse in the past 3 months.
Thank you so much, Evelien. Already bad situation became much worse in the last 3 months. You were referring to xenophobia, right-wing groups using this crisis to further strengthen this xenophobia feelings. But also you referred to the refugees, and the Greek government was abolishing almost asylum rights. Do you have other examples where maybe governments or EU institutions use this COVID crisis for their political reasons to keep migrants far away?
Yeah, well, we've seen that in Europe, the Dublin transfers stopped. So that's the transfers from people where they enter into countries like Italy or Greece and then are transferred to another country, for example, because they have family ties there. So that completely stopped as well. And of course, you know, movement in Europe stopped anyway. So there's a logic behind that as well. But I don't think that the implications on the ground for people having to live in these kind of camps in the border states of the EU were sufficiently thought through. And there's also, like, it's not EU, but Trump, for example, has said to hold all migration, right? Because he suggested or implied that it was migrants who were bringing in the COVID pandemic into the US, covering up basically the fact that he failed miserably in addressing the COVID situation in his own country. So we've seen it across the globe, actually, and actually it would be really interesting also to hear from participants if they have these kind of examples from leaders in their countries, whether that happened there or not.
Thank you, Evelien. Some people have been working very hard to get Mary Monday connected to the webinar. I see her in my screen, and Mary, I will unmute you, and I hope you can join us. Mary, do you hear me? I can't hear you. Oh, this is always an exciting moment. I think we have to move on. And meanwhile, some people keep on working very hard to get Mary Monday connected to our webinar, because I really would like to hear her thoughts and sharings and feelings about what is going on. You're still not with us, Mary? I see some movement, but I can't hear you yet. This is a live show, people. I think for now we should go on with Byrne, because and we try to fix the connection with Mary. I see you in my screen, but I can't hear you, alas. Ian, you're head of refugee and migrant rights of Amnesty International. You developed, among many other things, the 14 principles of protection for migrants and displacement. Please share with your thoughts, your reflections, your thoughts about how COVID crisis has an impact on the position of refugees and migrants.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Peter, and for inviting us to take part today. I mean, hopefully people on the call all heard of Amnesty International. As you said, I head actually quite a small team, but a team that works globally on refugees and migrant rights issues. But we also work very much with our colleagues on the ground in regional offices and sections. So only this morning, I was on a call with our colleagues in a Nairobi office that were looking at the situation of border closures in East Africa, and probably Mary will know far more about that than me, so I may well leave her to comment about that, but we are documenting that and we will go on that record shortly. We're obviously seeing many of the issues that Evelien touched on happening not just in Europe, but globally, whether it's the Rohingya being pushed back at sea by Malaysia, whether it's overcrowding and lack of access to basic healthcare in camps in Jordan of Syrian refugees, including pregnant women who can't get access to healthcare, whether it's closures of borders and pushbacks on the US border that Evelien touched on, but also in South America, for example, with the situation of Venezuelan refugees. I could go on and on about the situation. And Amnesty's job, obviously, is to remind states that even during a pandemic, their human rights obligations don't fall away. So it's our job, together with our partners, to hold states to account for those human rights obligations under international law, not just the Refugee Convention, but also the main human rights treaties that cover civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. And that's led us to make a number of general calls reminding states that the right to asylum, the right to be protected from non-refoulement, to be pushed back to persecution and torture, again, doesn't stop during this period. But of course, we're also seeing, as Evelien said, border closures, states clamping down, increased xenophobia, discrimination against some of the people in some of the most vulnerable situations, as Evelien said, in camps, but also in urban and peri-urban settings. And that's an area that we are beginning to focus more on, because we feel sometimes that doesn't get the attention it should, even though about 60% of refugees globally live in those settings and don't live in camps. We're also starting to look at the mental health impact as well. Because I think it is a terrible word, but I think COVID provides us with an opportunity, and it would be interesting to explore this further, as well as many threats. So it presents us with an opportunity sometimes to highlight issues, as has already been said, of these communities who have long-standing systemic violations and abuses perpetrated against them. So this presents us then with an opportunity sometimes to amplify that, but also to tell stories about how refugees are stepping up and contributing. And I would like the opportunity to talk more about that as well, because refugee leadership is also a stream of work that we are trying to promote, not just working on behalf of refugees, but working alongside refugees and showing that refugees and migrants are the best people sometimes to address the solutions and to step in, as we have been seeing during this time, offering skills, offering experience in communities where often the state is failing to do so. So how should we respond? So Peter's mentioned one initiative that we were involved in early on, which is the set of, and I'll just sort of get out the official name, Human Mobility and Human Rights in the COVID-19 Pandemic, Principles of Protection for Migrants, Refugees and Other Displaced Persons. And this was an initiative initially set up by a number of academic institutions, largely in the US. So it's quite a Western orientated project, which, you know, could also be criticized. And I think there was a reflection that the speed of the initiative was good, but maybe it could have been more inclusive with colleagues from the Global South, but nonetheless had a lot of expertise into it from Columbia, from the Zolberg Institute, from Cornell Law School, and they invited us to be part of this. And I just want to read one phrase from the commentary. The current crisis demands robust and effective action on the pandemic, but turbulent times do not justify claims that rights can be dispensed with or set aside because they are considered inconvenient to the pursuit of controlling the virus. It is precisely in such times that international human rights do their most important work, reminding us of the core principles of humanity we are struggling to preserve. So the 14 principles are based on existing international law. So they're not inventing new law, they're not inventing standards, but they are bringing them together in quite an accessible form of 14 sort of key principles that we think are very important to highlight. And I'm just going to sort of run them off. I'm not going to go into detail. Some of them hopefully should be self-explanatory. And again, I'm happy to discuss them and take questions and elaborate a bit further. But they range from equal treatment and non-discrimination to the need to combat stigma and xenophobia, basic socioeconomic rights, which is actually my day job. I should say that I actually am a lawyer working largely on economic and social rights. So right to health, also obviously other fundamental rights that we are seeing impacted on this time, such as housing, food, water, sanitation, and the impacts that they can have, particularly in people living in overcrowded spaces. The need to address restrictions on movement both between and within states, the enforcement of immigration law, including detention. So we've been calling amnesty for any person that's been detained for immigration purposes should be released without delay where there is a threat to their health. And actually, we've called out a number of governments, including the United States, on that. Right to protection, as I said, for life or health of a person in camps and informal settlements. Right to information. Again, we know that people in a vulnerable situation, such as refugees and migrants, often don't get access to the information they need in a language they understand, which obviously has public health implications as well as the rights implications for those individuals. The need to protect privacy. We're seeing some states using this as an opportunity to put in place draconian surveillance measures, often against people, again, in a vulnerable situation. Intersectionality regarding people within refugee and migrant communities, issues around gender, elder people, people with disabilities and children. The labour rights of workers, we already have a string of work around migrant workers, undocumented migrant workers, and we're seeing again how they can be particularly impacted, the fact that they can't access often basic services due to their status within countries. And we are calling for regularization to be considered by states where that would enable such migrants to access economic and social rights. And I'll finish with one last point. The principles make clear that any restrictions that need to be put in place need to have a legitimate aim and need to be proportionate and non-discriminatory. So we recognize that always during a public health crisis, you will need to sometimes limit rights. The question is where you get the balance. And we saw that with our work on Ebola in 2014, where sometimes you would have very draconian lockdowns. And again, we're seeing that again, which is obviously making it even more risky for people to be able to access their basic survival rights around food, healthcare, water, sanitation, when they're locked up 24/7 in very draconian ways. So the whole thing with the human rights, as people know, is a sort of balancing exercise. And our job is to try and hold states to account and try and ensure that they get that balance right. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. And I think Evelien is trying to ask me whether she could ask you a question. Of course you can, Evelien. And I think Mary Monday has almost a connection there. Is it a short question or a long question, Evelien?
Oh,
if it's a long question, we first go to Mary Monday. If it's a very short one, we can do it now.
It's a short question, I hope. But I don't know if the answer is going to be long.
Try to keep it short because I would love to hear Mary Monday also.
Let's go to Mary first and then I'll keep it for the next.
Thank you. Mary, I see there have been people working to get you connected and I hope you are connected now. Please take the floor. We were talking about leadership of refugees. I think you should be an example of it. Please share your comments with us. Oh, Jay. I don't think it will work.
Mary Monday. Let me hope you hear me.
We hear you loud and clear.
Are you
Go on,
getting
Mary.
me?
We've been waiting for you. Go in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm Mary Monday, a registered refugee in Bidbid Refugee Settlement, Yumbe, Northern Uganda. I work with ICAN as a child protection officer. And ICAN South Sudan is an organization led by a refugee. It is led by South Sudanese. It is engaging unaccompanied children unaccompanied refugee children in social and musical activities for them to heal the trauma whatsoever they are undergoing through in the conflicts, and to give children voices to advocate for peace and their rights. My typical work with the children, I make sure I interact with them to respond to their questions, encourage good practice and a healthy social interaction among the children, challenge behaviors that are not in contact with the code of conduct of organization, and our work has created a positive impact in the lives of these children who came without their parents, and we have witnessed many coming out from depression and becoming active and influential members to the children group. However, COVID-19 has put all our programs with children to a halt. We are not able to do our social activities with the children, no gathering, and even them coming together to play with their fellow friends. So all this is taking children back into traumatic situation where they cannot gather now together and share their ideas. And because of the COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 in the settlement or to the migrants, to the refugees, you find that this COVID-19 has really caused a lot of impact on the lives of refugees, of which one of it may be like the reduction of the food ratio in the settlement. It has really affected the refugees who are staying in the settlement. They used to get the food ratio, not of this amount, but because of the COVID-19, it becomes so hard for refugees now to survive because of the reduction of the food ratio, and the businesses are collapsed. Then there's also increase in food prices in the market. This is because of the COVID-19, and socially, no social gatherings, which increases trauma. Children are not gathering. Even people, women in the settlement, they used to gather to do their activities like the livelihood and a lot of things. And because of that, because of no social gathering, it has again created a traumatic situation where people can really not listen to, they cannot share ideas with themselves. So we look at it, it is really so challenging. And also the lockdown of schools in the settlement, it has created relaxation of pupils and students in the settlement where they are no longer studying and most of the things, because in the settlements, you find that in the towns, like with the host, they could access TV and radio, they study in, but now, because of the lockdown in the settlement, those things are not there. Our children are finding it so difficult to access their studies. And again, when you look at in the political aspect of bill, the closure of borders, which has led to many refugees caught up in South Sudan, not able to return to their families, those who went for their business, they were expecting themselves getting back in the settlement. They find it so hard to come back to the settlement, and because they are locked to that site. And also, the asylum process is closed, where South Sudanese cannot now access it. And the fact that the Uganda border is closed, which restricted the ability of South Sudanese to access asylum in Uganda. As a result of the closed borders, some people are resorting to cross through unofficial borders point where screening is not in place. This put everyone into risk, most especially the refugees, because there are people who get into the settlement and they are not screened, now it becomes so hard for us to get out of this pandemic or the COVID, because we can easily construct from those ones who came without being screened in the settlement. However, there are lots of things that really makes life so hard. Like when I talk about the healthy condition of the migrants or the refugees in the settlement, the legal crossing into the settlement is putting refugees at risk. This is due to lack of screening centers in the settlement, inadequate quarantine centers to accommodate the suspect or the patients. You find that there are no quarantine centers when there are suspects which are taken to the quarantine centers. They are combined in a room. 4 of them would be sleeping in the same room. And this is so risky. Yesterday, I was interacting with my neighbor. He was taken there he has spent like a month. He has been taken as one of the suspects, of which he was tested negative. And because some people got among them positive, that is why he is able to be detained there. And they added for him 2 more weeks. And now it is making like a 1.5 months. This is because of the inadequate quarantine centers, which are not in place in the settlement. And also they are not in the settlement, but they are from the host community. And that one is established by the government of Uganda. That is where refugees are taken. And also the testing kits or the equipments in the health centers and in quarantines are not there, honestly, where when you are taken as a suspect, they pick your sample and take it up to Kampala or Entebbe, of which it is so hard for people to, until you wait for us. That's whereby you will now see whether you are positive or negative, but you will be joined together. And not only that, because in the quarantine itself, the patients or the suspected cases in the quarantine, sometimes they share equipment together like jerry cans, even they get food randomly, and also there's a shortage of food in the quarantine, which we look into it. That is another way of one. Even if you're taken from home, you might be negative, but because of that, because of all the situation that you may be passing through in the quarantine, can lead you really to get infected by this virus.
Thank you so much, Mary. Yes, thank you, Mary. Thank you for your contribution. This is a bad story you have to tell. Inadequate health support, food prices going up, food ratios going down. That doesn't help the projects and the programs of ICANN. Many negative impacts. There were 2 more issues I would like you to elaborate a little bit on. How it is in the refugee camps. The one is here in Europe, we have this social distancing and we keep 1.5 meters apart from each other. When we go out, we can use the masks to prevent that we contaminate other people with the virus. How do you cope with this distancing in a refugee camp like Bidi? That's the one question. And the other question I have for you, does COVID also has an impact on the relation between the people of Bidi camp and the local people surrounding Bidi camp? Does it have a positive or negative influence on that relationship? Could you please tell a little bit about those 2 things, Mary?
Okay, thank you so much. To start with the first question, honestly, in the settlement or in the camp, there are no face masks, and the protective or the protective gears against this COVID-19, it is honestly poor in the settlement. As I talk now, none of the refugees has accessed this face mask and even gloves, a lot of things that the refugees or the migrants are really missing as far as concerned in protection of this COVID. Then to the second question about the relationship or the impact of this COVID into the relationship of the host and the refugees or the migrants in the camp, it has caused also the negative impact in the other way around, because now refugees are not able to access the normal amount of the food ration, and they end up going to the host looking for land to cultivate, and of which there it has caused the land wrangles between the refugees and the host, where there's a land grabbing away from the refugees. You find that you may cultivate someone's land, the other day someone comes from there taking away the land from you, and that one, it has really caused misunderstanding or poor relationship with the host and the refugees.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. I think we soon move back to Evelien because he had a question for Ian, but I want to check with Johanna. Is there anything going on in the chat box, or do we have a very silent audience at the moment?
Not yet, really. So if you have any questions, please post them either in the chat box or in the Q&A section, and then we can bring them in.
Thank you, Johanna. Thank you. Evelien, what was your question for Ian, or do you want to reflect on Mary's contribution?
Yeah, no, at first I want to ask Ian about the, no, he was saying it's of course, it remains so important to call out behavior of states or bad practices and policies, right? And you've done so by publishing, for example, these 14 principles and saying this is the standard that you have to live up to. But I was wondering if he had the same experience as Oxfam had, that particularly in March and April, it's been so challenging to get this message across, because we found that the media in particular is focusing so much on the situation of, of national issues instead of focusing on the vulnerable position that many refugees and migrants are in. So I was wondering if you had any good experiences or if you also found this calling out very difficult and challenging.
Ian, please.
Well, it's a very good question. I think if you work in human rights, and I would include actually everybody on the call, because if you're working in development, you're working in human rights. It's always a challenge, isn't it, colleagues, to be able to get changes in behavior and to be able to get that oxygen of publicity. We're seeing now internally at Amnesty, and I'm saying this constantly because I actually work across two teams, as I said. I'm still a lawyer and advisor on economic and social rights, as well as temporarily heading the refugee team. That there are long-standing issues that are still going on regardless of COVID. And obviously, you're right, during the past few months, and I think what's interesting we see about COVID, isn't it, that for many, many years, there have been pandemics in the global south, such as Ebola, such as MERS, SARS, if you count sort of the East Asia as being part of the global south. But let's say it hadn't really seriously impacted the West, Western Europe, where we are, the United States, North America. But as soon as it's done that this time, of course, everything is now COVID related, COVID saturated. And you're right. And then we're being asked totally internally, come up with COVID related stories, COVID related angles. And yes, there's lots of human issues around COVID, but at the same time, there's always long-standing issues that I think we all recognise with affecting refugees and migrants that will continue to exist post-COVID. As some of these countries come out of lockdown, then maybe there's the chance, and we're already starting to talk about it internally, that actually there's even a fatigue we see sometimes in the media about COVID stories, and they want other stories. So I think that's one thing to say. I think, again, as sadly as other countries, and Mary will know this better than me, in the global south are maybe still coming up to the height of the pandemic, that it will still be very much sort of COVID related. And as you said, I suppose about nationals, the citizens, if you like, however you want to frame it, and the fear of the other, as you said, Evelien, about xenophobia, stigma, the fear of people bringing in this virus, the way that's obviously emboldened Trump and Bolsonaro and Orban in Europe and other people to say, well, it's all being spread by other people. It justifies our sort of xenophobia, anti-foreigner kind of stance. And of course, refugees and migrants are particularly in the firing line for that. And we know even within that there are good migrants and bad migrants. So you've got the terminology about illegal migrants, which of course we don't use. We use people in irregular status But again, just to even get that kind of messaging over is very difficult at this time. You know, there's a very right-wing guy that some of you may have heard of in Europe called Nigel Farage, who until actually yesterday, but he actually went so over the top during the Black Lives Matter debate that he's now actually been sacked by a talk radio station, and he was constantly going down to our Channel border in Kent and constantly saying, "Oh, we've got waves of these migrants coming in on these boats every day, and it's wrong, and we should be turning them back." And it enables him to feed into this narrative. So to get the oxygen and publicity is challenging at any time, but you're right, particularly at this time, to talk about refugees and migrants. I think, though, we've seen in some of the coverage we get, and of course it varies from place to place, we got a lot of pickup with the stories we've been doing around the pushbacks on the Rohingya in Southeast Asia that we're seeing in Thailand and Malaysia, for example. We got some pickup with some of the work we've been doing in the Levant, around Jordan and Lebanon. And we do obviously cut through sometimes with our work in the Americas as well, particularly North America. But it is challenging. I won't deny that. You know, we're constantly sort of monitoring the kind of media hits we get. And also there's a lot of misrepresentation, as I said, in the media. People sort of lump together asylum seekers, refugees, migrants. So there's a need to clarify that there are different people on the move who have different status, facing different threats, different risks. And you've got to try and come up with stories, I think, that is not just commentary pieces. You know, we're seeing lots of commentary pieces, including by Amnesty, but actually has got some research behind it to actually show, as Mary, I thought, very powerfully articulated, and that's what we need actually at Amnesty, is always people on the ground who can tell us what is the reality like for lived experience day to day, rather than just me writing something in London on a very general commentary piece. So I think the more we've got actually sort of hard stories, cutting edge stories, we can cut through, but I won't estimate it's quite difficult.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. Mary, maybe I can ask you to reflect on the same issue, because Evelien tells us that it is very hard to get into the media, to get the stories forward about vulnerable people who are being maybe hit much harder by the COVID crisis than other groups. Everything in the newspapers, at the radio, the television, every day we are talking about COVID, but it's always the problems of the strong groups, like the companies, and it's very hard to get attention for the vulnerable groups. Can you perhaps tell how it is in Uganda? What do the newspapers and the radio stations talk about? Is it also about how the strong groups are being hurt by the crisis, or do they have also an eye for vulnerable groups like refugees?
Sorry, I would like you to come again with the question. I did not pick you well.
Could you perhaps?
Because of the network.
Oh, okay. Shall I repeat very shortly?
Yes.
What are the newspapers and the radio stations in Uganda talking about, and as it is related to COVID? Do they have room and attention for the consequences of the crisis for vulnerable groups like the refugee?
Okay, in Uganda, the radios, because now in the settlement, most of the refugees, not most of the refugees, they don't have access to listen to news because of no access of radios in the settlement. That is why it becomes so hard for them to listen to them. Hello?
Yeah, I understand. It's hard to listen. Thank you. Yeah. There is in the chat box one question for Ian, and I think it might be interesting for Ian to elaborate a little bit on it. The question was to hear any reflections on the conflicting rights, which of course the right for asylum and access, but there was also a right for national public health. And what do you feel when these two get conflicted, when they are hitting each other? How should you deal with it?
Yeah, no, as I said in the chat, it's a key question, isn't it? Thank you, Elizabeth. And as I said in my initial presentation, you know, as a lawyer, you know, I always say, you know, rights are a constant balance and conflict. You know, there are some fundamentals that we should never undermine, obviously, the right to be protected from torture and cruel and inhuman treatment. And that's a fundamental aspect of international law. And I think connected to that is non-refoulement. So that's why we say, and unfortunately it's not happening, and we are seeing people being sent back. Turkey has begun to send back people to Syria. Lebanon, we're also seeing that. And we would say that in some cases, and we're obviously documenting those cases, which sometimes is not easy, obviously, particularly at the moment in terms of research, but we're obviously having to work with an extensive network of contacts to be able to be in touch with people, but they are being pushed back at risk of persecution. So we would argue in those cases, you cannot renege on those fundamental principles. Similarly with the right to seek asylum. Now, we're not saying it's challenging at this time when borders are being closed. Sometimes legitimately, sometimes it's very difficult to see, I think certainly in my own government's case, in terms of actually having a plan, a public health plan to address this epidemic, whereby they seem to leave the borders very open at one stage and now they're closing them all again very suddenly, much after we are now have about the worst death rate in the world per capita. So, you know, we will continue to ask and call for the right to asylum, to seek asylum, should be upheld, because there is still this need to uphold asylum. As you know, as Mary said, we are seeing in East Africa, there are still people coming from conflict, from South Sudan, from Somalia, other places, who need to seek refuge and asylum. And again, and we see it sadly from people who are anti-foreigner, who are xenophobic, that they will lump a lot of these people as, particularly if they come to Europe, as economic migrants, rather than actually recognizing a lot of the time that many have genuine refugee claims. We can debate whether the current definition of a refugee is too narrow, and I think many people would see that the 1951 definition doesn't really meet the 21st century definition. Whether you look at climate crisis, economic push factors, social push factors, that's another issue. But even on the very narrow framing of people's right to seek asylum, that has to be a fundamental right, because otherwise what you're saying is you are placing those people at risk, at the very minimum, of sometimes cruel and inhuman treatment and sometimes death. So on one hand, you are closing your borders to protect life, largely obviously of people within your own state, but you are condemning others to death, potentially. So you have to look at those implications. Now, how those asylum flows are managed, but of course, as Evelien said, we were already seeing that in terms of Libya, in terms of Greece, where asylum seekers were not able to claim asylum and to get pushbacks and other things, the whole Dublin Agreement, etc., etc. The way that the EU has managed the refugee situation, I wouldn't call it a crisis, because I think that's feeds into this fear-mongering, but the way that it's been played out since the Syrian conflict has been awful. We know that. And it is still important to say the majority of the world's refugees and IDPs are in the global south. And so we also recognize that countries such as Lebanon, where we are seeing pushbacks, that those countries are struggling to cope with the numbers of refugees, already having long-standing refugee communities such as the Palestinians. And so we see that COVID has exacerbated that. So I recognize that, as I said, when you manage a public health crisis, there will be restrictions on freedom of movement, there will be restrictions on civil liberties, but we have to be able to still to remind governments of those obligations. We may not have all the answers as to how they manage those obligations effectively during a public health crisis, but they can't just disregard them. And sadly, we're seeing too many governments disregard them. And of course, in many countries like the Philippines, like the US anyway, Brazil, they have a very low regard for human rights anyway. So for them, it's quite easy to tear up the rule book and just put people's rights at risk.
Thank you, Ian. See, we're already going on for 50 minutes, so I think we surely should get to the finish of this COVID Café. There was one interesting question in the Q&A box, and Ian already touched upon it, and I'm going to ask you all three to reflect on it, but briefly, please. Ian already tells it's nasty to talk about opportunities during such a crisis with so big risks, but perhaps there are opportunities we can use this crisis for. So Perhaps you can share with us either a good story, a good result from the COVID crisis, or such an opportunity we should really grasp at the moment. I will start with Evelien, then I go to Mary, then I go to Ian, and then we do the wrap up. Is that okay, Evelien? We didn't hear you for a while. Could you give an example, or perhaps a chance we shouldn't waste?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's actually multiple examples that I can mention, which is, I mean, I won't mention them all because I know that we're almost out of time, but it's not all gloom, doom and gloom. So one thing that I find particularly inspiring is that with regard to irregular migrants, particularly in Europe, like I mentioned before, them not having access to healthcare or to proper accommodation, there's actually been a really big push from the bottom up, from migrant-led organizations for regularization of irregular migrants. And we've seen that mostly in Spain, but it's now spreading across Europe. And it's really inspiring to see how migrant-led organizations are leading on this and are fighting this fight, and that they're joined by other local organizations and national organizations by Oxfam, but that there are also some governments that are now picking up this cry for regularization. So we've seen it in Portugal, and Spain is working on new laws. We've seen it in Italy. It's far from being perfect, and much still needs to be changed, but at least it's something for the good. And hopefully we can now, through this pandemic, really see and feel how migrants and refugees are part of the fabric of our societies, and how they have contributed, and really, use that knowledge and feeling to help regularize irregular migrants.
Thank you, Evelien. Mary, do you have any good examples or chances we should grasp at the moment due to the COVID crisis? Please share your thoughts.
Hello.
Yeah, there you are. Please go on, Mary.
Can you listen to me?
Do you have any examples, good examples of positive effects of this nasty crisis of COVID, chances we might grasp, things that might be a good follow-up to this bad happenings like the COVID crisis? Can you share any good examples with us?
Okay, thank you so much. I am looking into the strategies like the prevention strategy and the coping strategy that they should be put in place, like how can we prevent this virus by making sure that the community is aware about how they can prevent this virus. When I talk of prevention strategy, I mean of washing hands and creating awareness to the refugees such that they will know about the dangers of this COVID-19, and again, how they can prevent themselves from getting it. Because as I talk now, they don't have really the knowledge about the COVID-19 because they are not sensitized and they don't know that what are they supposed to do. And even as I talk, there are still gatherings, public gatherings, and even the shaking hands are still continuing in the settlement, which is really so hard for the refugees to be safe in the settlement. And what are they supposed to do? Like when someone is taken as a suspect, what is this person to do? How can this person cope up? This person has to be provided a good medication or the quarantine or the isolation room such that it will avoid this same patient from affecting more people. That is really what and the other thing also I would like really to recommend is that if possible, that the government should put another system to allow people to seek asylum and at the same time protect public, for example, ensuring screening and the quarantine facilities as asylum seekers. Because when now it is not put in place, and as we all know that the prolonged war of South Sudan is still ongoing, people find this hard to access the asylum process, which is really not good. And as I talk now, still war is going on in South Sudan, of which many people are losing their lives. And because of now it becomes so hard for them to cross the border to come in.
Thank you, Mary.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ian, do you have an example of an opportunity we should not waste?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think there's a lot of discussion, and we're certainly having at Amnesty, and I'm sure you have, about whether we're going, you know, what is the new normal? And is the new normal going to become the normal after all this dies down? You know, I've lived long enough, sadly, to say, you know, you've seen other times where you think, oh, there's going to be fundamental change, and then things largely go back. You know, I think people are looking at whether it's on climate, or whether it's on the way that we just to social protection for people. The debate now, isn't there, about should we move to greater schemes of social protection, whether that's universal basic income, so everybody in the country, regardless of your status, is paid something. And of course that will help tremendously. You know, particularly I'm seeing it in this country. I have to say, you know, the 5th richest country in the world, the UK, people are being left destitute during this time, particularly asylum seekers, let alone obviously irregular migrants. So I think we have to look at examples. I saw on one of the Q&A, you know, I think somebody raised a very good example of Portugal regularizing migrants. So it shows that if countries want to be innovative, if they actually want to take a different approach, a different socioeconomic model, they can do that if they've got the courage. But we know, sadly, governments work in very short-term political cycles. They often feed into, as we see with Trump and his ilk, Bolsonaro, they feed into the worst aspects of society. And obviously part of that is blaming the other, whether you blame the other for the virus. But I think there are positive things that go beyond refugees and migrants about the way that we run our societies that could get traction. And it's obviously up to us to promote it. I mean, Amnesty has been notoriously cautious on suggesting different socioeconomic models. I think because international law itself has been quite cautious on this stuff. So that's one thing. I think, as I said, on the more positive side, what we're seeing is refugee organizations stepping up. And I will share an article that my colleague wrote, Victor Naimu, who's based in East Africa, that Mary may know him, about a couple of initiatives, one in Uganda, one in Kenya, self-help initiatives that have been providing food, basic services to refugee communities themselves. So they are stepping into the gap that sadly, for whatever reason, the state is unable to do. And we recognize that, you know, particularly in the global south, states do have limited resources, but also it's how you choose to allocate those resources. And I think it's getting the message through that nobody should be left destitute this time. And at the same time, you know, often refugees have been stepping in. You know, I've seen it in my own country with doctors and nurses who have been refugees, come to this country, and they have built up professional careers who are stepping in. And I think we are really seeing a shifting debate. Now, again, whether we can get traction on that debate or whether it will just go back to, you know, the old kind of tropes about people coming here who are not contributing, let's see. I think we also obviously have this current wave around Black Lives Matters and anti-racism. Will that also benefit some of the narratives that we've got, or will it just also feed, sadly, the kind of racism that we see in terms of pushback? So it's a constant struggle. I think the more that we can push to good examples, whether it's by governments or whether it's by communities, that gives us ammunition. And certainly for Amnesty, we want to try and be as propositional. When we produce our reports, we want to be able to make concrete recommendations that states say, well, look, this state is doing it this way. Maybe you can learn from that state about how they can do things differently that actually have better outcomes.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, this was also the question of Mies in the Q&A box. I'm gonna share it with later with the panelists, but also with the rest. He was asking for any examples of governments who did take some good measures for refugees and migrants to mitigate the consequences of COVID-19. Anybody who has a good example, please send it to me or to Johanna. kuno@kunoplatform.nl. You can find the email address on our website, and then we bring it back to you, Wismaas. I think we have to finish this because we're almost 1 hour going on. Evelien, to finish, to wrap up, what is your main learning of this afternoon, of this 1 hour we have been having this COVID Café?
Oh, there's been so much, and I really enjoyed listening to my fellow panelists. And I think what two things that I take with me. The first is how incredibly impactful this crisis has been and still is for refugees and migrants. And I think that that the pandemic has really caused a lot of people to look inwards and really look at your own position, but it remains so important to realize what this is meaning for people in more vulnerable positions, and to be able to do that and to listen to other people and hear their stories in the media as well, which is increasingly happening, which is, you know, the media is not all bad. We've seen a lot of reports about refugees and migrants who are contributing some way or the other. Ian just mentioned the example of doctors and nurses who are contributing, and I think the more we hear and see these kind of examples, the more the easier it is to step in each other's shoes and to realize how difficult it is for other people. So so that's one important thing, and the other is that something Ian said about the laws that we already have, like the 14 principles that he and others came up with. They're not new, right? They're already here. So there's already such a broad framework and regime that we can work with. And it's very important to keep doing that and to keep referring back to these principles that we all agreed on in better times, and that we should stick to them in these difficult times as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Evelien van Roemburg from Oxfam International. I also want to thank Mary Monday from ICANN and Ian Byrne from Amnesty International. And I will thank all the participants and attendees for being with us and for sharing your thoughts. The next COVID Café will not be next week. We take a week off, but the week after that, we are still planning. So I don't have a subject yet. And if there are any good ideas in the audience, a topic we could address during the COVID Café, please reach out to us, and perhaps we're going to do this topic together with you. So thank you all. See you next time, hopefully, and bye-bye.
Thank you.